everyone. Today we will be reviewing the Supreme Court's decision on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act 2010 in the case of For Women Scotland Limited and the Scottish Ministers. The central dispute in this case was how the words sex, woman, and man, as used in the Equality Act 2010, should be understood in light of the Gender Recognition Act 2004. The Equality Act 2010 is UK domestic legislation which seeks to give statutory protection to people who are at risk of discrimination due to certain characteristics which they possess, such as race, sex, religion, disability, and so on. The Gender Recognition Act, on the other hand, allows a person whose gender identity is different from the sex originally registered on their birth certificate to obtain a Gender Recognition Certificate, or GRC, which provides legal recognition of their acquired gender. This legal recognition is subject to some exceptions contained in Section 9, such as peerages, succession, and it should not contradict provisions in other legislation. Background. The legal dispute began in Scotland, where the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018, or ASP 2018, introduced the objective that 50% of non-executive members on public boards should be women and included those with the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. This definition was successfully challenged at the Inner House by the non-profit women's group For Women Scotland, who argued that it was unlawful as it involved an area of law reserved only for the UK Parliament and was therefore outside the jurisdiction of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish government, in response to this, issued guidance which stated that the definition of a woman under the ASP 2018 was the same as that under the Equality Act 2010 and would include a person with a GRC which recognizes their gender as female. This guidance was challenged in the Outer House by For Women Scotland, who argued that a GRC does not alter a person's sex for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010. The Outer House ruled in favor of the government that sex is not limited to biological sex, but also includes those with a GRC. This decision was appealed to the Inner House, which affirmed the Outer House's decision and stated there was no conflation of the two protected characteristics of gender reassignment and sex, and that a person with a GRC possessed both characteristics separately. The appellants then appealed to the UK Supreme Court. Decision of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in its decision, stressed that it was not its role to adjudicate in the public domain on the meaning of gender and sex, or to define the word woman other than when it is used in the Equality Act 2010. To do this, it would consider the terms context and purpose of the Equality Act and determine which interpretation of sex was intended by Parliament and which interpretation would allow the provisions of the Act to be consistent, coherent, and reasonable. The court found that as a matter of ordinary language, the provisions relating to sex discrimination can only be understood as referring to biological sex. For example, the provisions relating to pregnancy and maternity are based on getting pregnant and giving birth. As a matter of biology, only biological women could get pregnant. It also identified other problems which an interpretation of certified sex rather than biological sex would cause. For example, creating confusion and impracticability in carrying out provisions relating to single-sex characteristic associations and charities, women's fair participation in sports, the armed services, and public sector equality duty. The court concluded that the meanings of the terms sex, man, and woman in the Equality Act refer to biological sex, and that any other interpretation would make the act incoherent and impracticable to operate. Further implications. It is important to note that this decision of the court does not take away protection from trans people with or without a GRC, as they are protected under the grounds of gender reassignment in the Equality Act. In addition, they are also protected from direct discrimination and indirect discrimination based on being perceived as or associated with a sex. So a trans woman would be able to claim sex discrimination because she is perceived to be a woman. Therefore, although the meaning of the terms sex, man, and woman in the Equality Act 2010 has been interpreted to mean biological sex, this does not remove any protection from trans people, as they are still protected under the Act. Thank you for listening, and please like, share, and subscribe.